Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Mike Connors. I'm the Director of Customer Success at Ecobot. This is the 7th in Ecobot and Esri's series on the convergence of technology and wetland science. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. So today's topic is technology's response to wetland policy changes. We have a great panel of presenters today who will be introduced in just a bit. Thanks for you all for being here to share your expertise. For everyone in the audience, I want to just draw your attention to the Q&A button down at the bottom of the Zoom window. We're going to hold our Q&A till the end, but please, at any point during the presentation, when the moment strikes you, please use that Q&A to ask a question. And if you could also, please let us know who you're directing that question to in case it's a little bit later when we get to answering those, so it's a little bit easier for everyone to stay organized on that. We will do our best to get to all those questions, and we might go over by just a little bit if we still have some good questions to tackle. Also, as another note, we're recording this webinar, so if you need to leave early or if you join late or just want to watch it again later, we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone linking to where you can get the video. Our co-host today, Daniel Martin, a consultant and project manager with Esri and with a background in ecology and mitigation, as well as my colleague at Ecobot, the Chief Scientific Officer, Jeremy Schewe, with nearly 2 decades as a wetland scientist. So I'm going to kick it over to Jeremy to get started.
Great, thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. As Mike said, again, this is our 7th in this series, so pretty excited for our group of panelists and presenters today. Also, for those of you who had signed up early, thank you for your patience. We did have the request from the Society for Wetland Scientists to postpone this to this week because there was going to be a conflict with the annual meeting that was held online this year for the first time. So that turned out to be a really great conference, and super excited to have been part of it. But we are excited today to talk with you from a few different angles, the changes in policy in respect to wetlands from the consulting side and from the mitigation banking side, and also from the software side of things. So I'm Jeremy Schewe, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer with Ecobot.
Hello, everybody. This is Daniel Martin. I'm the other co-host today, consultant project manager with Esri. And I think we have a great show lined up.
So this is why we're all here. I remember a few years ago around Christmas time playing Jenga with my family, and one of my cousins who happens to sit on the other side of the political extreme looked at me and he said, "Hey, this is just like policy. People just keep stacking things up and trying to get it to balance and not fall over and keep everybody happy. The only difference is with policy, everything's not shaped exactly the same, so they fit together perfectly like this. You can imagine all the infrastructure that's needed in order to sustain changes in policy, and then the implementation or the regulation of those policies. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. Just thinking about it in respect to wetlands, waters of the United States, everything is connected. It's hard to take apart one thing or another, and what the recent changes to rules around the waters of the United States intended to do was try to create a line, a delineation between what was a navigable water, or what was a jurisdictional water, and what was not. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that in depth from Daniel DeJoode here in a little bit.
So to take you folks through a quick look at our agenda today, we're going to briefly introduce the panelists. Then we have a couple of presentations looking at the impacts of policy changes. We're going to discuss the digitizing of data and what that means kind of in the big picture of wetland science, announce the next webinar, and then with remaining time, we'll transition into Q&A. So our panelists today are Daniel DeJoode. He's a wetland science with Braun Intertec Corp. Victoria Colangelo, the CEO of the Mitigation Banking Group. Corinna, senior biologist with Wood. And Jeff Pearson, geographer with Esri.
Great. So let's take a look in here together. So I want to introduce Daniel DeJoode with Braun Intertec, based in Minnesota. All right, Daniel.
Thanks, Jeremy. And thank you, Daniel. And thank you for the folks at Ecobot and Esri for making this webinar possible. I'm going to talk today about some changes and proposed changes to federal policies that affect wetlands, waters of the U.S., how they're defined, and how they're permitted. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and the objective stated in the Clean Water Act was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. However, the Clean Water Act did not define waters of the U.S. Congress passed a law that regulated the waters, but they did not define what a water is. Next slide. So the definition of what is a water of the U.S. has been subject to rulemaking through federal agencies, primarily the EPA and the Corps of Engineers, over the decades since the Clean Water Act was passed, and then has also been shaped by litigation, challenging various aspects of the way rules are defined and implemented. Most recently, there's been rulemaking undertaken for related to waters of the U.S. In 2019, the Corps and EPA proposed a new rule redefining waters of the U.S. They received 500,000 comments on that proposed rule. Also in 2019, they rescinded what was the existing rule of waters of the U.S., and that was called the Clean Water Rule. And that was a rule that had been published and finalized in 2015. So that was formally rescinded in 2019. And then in 2020, in April of this year, they published the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and that rule became effective on June 22nd, 2020. So that is now the rule defining waters of the U.S. for almost every part of the country, and I'll get to that, why it's different. It's in one place. Next slide. Not all waters are created equal. Can you advance, Jeremy? So I'm gonna have, okay, back up now, sorry. I had some graphics on here to explain different waters. If you look at the center of the lower right, there's the large water body. That's a navigable water, yeah, thank you. That is what gives the federal government the opportunity, the right to regulate activities affecting waters and wetlands. That's a navigable water body, which is involved in interstate commerce. The US Constitution has a commerce clause that gives Congress the right to regulate interstate commerce. And because of that, a whole host of environmental regulations are possible, including the Clean Water Act. So not only is there navigable waters, there are tributaries to the navigable waters, and those include ephemeral tributaries, ephemeral streams, intermittent streams, perennial streams, and that there are wetlands that are some part of them are part of the waters of the US, and it depends on whether they're adjacent or whether they have a connection and the type of connection. There are also waters that are totally isolated with no surface water connection, and there's groundwater. So there's a lot of different ways you can define water, a lot of different ways water occurs in the environment. And so those are all different features that become important in regulation under the Clean Water Act. Okay, next slide. I've got a few slides here that just have some text on. I apologize because that's kind of boring. No good pictures of waters or anything like that, but I have these few slides because I want to focus in on the Navigable Waters Protection Rule and be really explicit about what this rule covers and what it doesn't cover. If you want to read more about it, the citation from the Federal Register, or the Code of Federal Regulations is there at the bottom. There are 4 things that are regulated water bodies, and they're defined here. Territorial seas, traditional navigable waters, tributaries, as I was mentioning before, certain lakes, ponds, impoundments of jurisdictional waters, and wetlands adjacent to other jurisdictional waters. Now, the next couple of slides are going to be the exemptions to the water body. So these 4 things are what is defined as a water of the US. So only 4 things, 4 types of water bodies are waters of the US. Next slide. Here are the exclusions. The first one, waters or features not defined above. That broadly includes wetlands that are not adjacent to tributaries or to navigable waters. So that's where this rule excludes totally isolated water bodies. Groundwater is excluded, and groundwater was never included in any regulations of waters of the US. Ephemeral features are things that only flow briefly, streams, ephemeral streams, not all streams, just ephemeral streams, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. then rills, swales, things that are surface water drainage features. And then other things, diffuse stormwater, things in uplands, prior converted cropland, irrigated areas and uplands. Next slide. And all the exemptions on this slide pertain to mostly things that were created, constructed mostly in uplands, and they were created for a purpose, or they were created as a hole or something, or a pit that was created for mining with no intention of creating a water or a water body or a wetland, or they were constructed for certain purposes, or an artificial lake, reflecting pool, or stormwater ponds. So things like these artificial things, artificially created things in uplands are excluded. They are not waters of the US. Okay, next slide. Okay, adjacent wetlands. We've mentioned that a couple times. Adjacent wetlands are regulated waters of the US under the current rule of the Clean Water Act. Isolated wetlands are not. So how do you know? How do you determine if something's adjacent or not? So the new rule defines adjacent with these criteria. It's adjacent to A1 through A3 waters. What does that mean? Think back a couple slides. That refers to traditional navigable waters, territorial seas, tributaries, or lakes and impoundments. And to be adjacent, it has to abut that wetland, the water body, or be flooded from that water body in a typical year. And this new rule incorporates the concept of a typical year in terms of hydrology, climate conditions, based on a 30-year rolling average to define what is a typical year. Adjacent wetlands can be separated from other traditional or jurisdictional waters by a natural berm or dune. If they're separated by an artificial barrier, there has to be a direct connection, surface water connection in a typical year. So the important implications of this new rule, this new definition, it eliminates connectivity of wetlands by ephemeral streams. So ephemeral streams are not jurisdictional water bodies, and an ephemeral stream is not sufficient connection for a wetland to be considered to be an adjacent wetland. And it also eliminates a case-specific significant nexus. In my presentation of waters of the US, I glossed over about 30 years, 40 years of rulemaking and litigation on waters of the US. Prior to this Navigable Waters Protection Rule, there was a Supreme Court case in 2008, 2006 that introduced the concept of a significant nexus, which was important for the rules, the way the rules were interpreted and defined up to this Navigable Water Protection Rule. So basically the significant nexus said that for a wetland to be considered adjacent, there has to be a significant nexus that has some impact on the biological, physical, chemical properties of the downstream water. So this new rule eliminates case-specific significant nexus concerns. Next slide. Prior to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule being implemented this year, a water body, a stream, was regulated based on if it has a definable bed and bank. So that would distinguish a stream from, say, a surface water drainage feature, a swale or a ditch or something like that, that does not have a definable bed and bank. So if you could define a bed and bank, and you need about 10 minutes of training to be able to recognize a definable bed and bank. If you could define a bed and bank, then it was a water of the US. It didn't matter what the duration of stream flow was in that water body. It could be ephemeral, intermittent, or perennial. Well, now that difference has taken on an important meaning, important distinction under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The ephemeral stream flows briefly, periodically during a given year in response to snow melt or precipitation. There's no input from groundwater. An intermittent stream flows continuously at certain times of the year, and it may receive groundwater discharge as part of its base flow in certain times of the year. A perennial stream flows year-round. Base flow is maintained by groundwater discharge. So now, rather than defining a jurisdictional stream based on definable bed and bank, it's based on things that are harder to see, like groundwater contribution. And there are methods available in certain parts of the country on things to look at to help determine if a stream is ephemeral, intermittent, presence of aquatic vegetation or aquatic life, certain characteristics of the channel and the banks, things like that. But it made this significantly more difficult to determine if a stream is a regulated water of the US or not. So next slide. Now, transitioning to talk about nationwide permits. These are permits authorized by the Corps of Engineers to allow for projects that would impact waters or wetlands. Nationwide permits are a class of permits that are applied to predefined categories with relatively limited impacts to waters or wetlands. There are 52 categories of nationwide permits, and in general, they apply to things with minimal adverse impact. And because they apply to predefined things with minimal adverse impact, they allow for a streamlined permitting process rather than a more involved, longer process involving more factors to evaluate. So this is really the workhorse of the Corps of Engineers permitting program. Lots and lots of activities are permitted with nationwide permits, relatively fast review and authorization. Next slide. There are several different permits available through the Corps of Engineers. At the top of this slide, I have a couple of categories of no impact or exemptions, things where there either is no water body present or there's a water body present, but it's exempt. So going back to the slides earlier under the Navigable Water Protection Rule, things that are exempt. So in those two categories, you don't need a Corps of Engineers permit for anything that affects those water bodies. If there is a water body, a stream, water of the US, or wetland that is not exempt, that's affected by a permit, then you would need a Corps of Engineers permit. And the categories underneath the yellow line are permits that are authorized with conditions. So you can do a project and there are conditions that apply to it. The middle one that says NWP, no PCN, that's a nationwide permit with no pre-construction notification, also called a non-reporting nationwide permit. And that means you don't need to submit an application to the Corps of Engineers. If you propose a project that's going to impact wetlands and you meet these predefined categories for minimal impact, you may not even have to submit an application. You can go do your project without receiving a written authorization from the Corps of Engineers. But it's important to remember there are permit conditions that apply to that work. Even though the Corps of Engineers isn't going to send you a signed piece of paper saying you've got a permit, here are the conditions, you have to know if you're using that non-reporting permit that there are conditions that apply. And then moving down, the next level of permitting are nationwide permits where there is a pre-construction notification required. In other words, an application is required. And then there's an individual permit. And I said the nationwide permits are for things that are relatively minor impacts, predefined activities. Individual permit is for anything that doesn't fit into those categories. So then there's no limit on how big a project could be, how much acreage or how many water bodies could be affected. If it's a large enough project, it will go into an individual permit. These are things that require an application. In certain Corps of Engineers districts, there are regional general permits and letters of permission that may replace nationwide permits in some conditions. But I'm providing all this detail in the permitting about nationwide permits because this is important to understand the proposed changes to nationwide permits because they involve both how nationwide permits are defined and then the criteria on whether or not a nationwide permit is reporting or non-reporting. Okay, next slide. Typically for nationwide permits, they allow up to ½ an acre of loss of waters or wetlands. And in certain nationwide permits where streams would be affected, they would allow up to loss of 300 linear feet of stream bed. And if a project is going to exceed the ½ acre of impact or the 300-foot linear stream impact, then an individual permit is required. And those have more requirements for documentation, more review, environmental review, and can trigger a NEPA review, a National Environmental Policy Act that may require an environmental assessment, environmental impact statement. Next slide. Nationwide permits were proposed for renewal in September of 2020. They're on a 5-year cycle where they're renewed every 5 years, and they were up for renewal in 2022. They will expire in 2022. The Corps of Engineers proposed an early renewal for all the nationwide permits in response to two things: several executive orders proposing or directing federal agencies to look for 8 ways to reduce regulation, streamline permitting, and foster and enhance economic development, and then some litigation that went to federal and Supreme Court that affect the implementation or the interpretation of nationwide permits. So the proposal was published in September. I'm going to just hit on a couple of major changes to this, but overall they're proposing modifying 9 nationwide permits and creating 5 new nationwide permits. And I'll touch on those just a little bit. And then there's a lot of tweaking to some general conditions that are relatively minor. And they're proposing to renew all the nationwide permits now rather than some now and then some in 2022. So they would change the 5-year cycle rather from what it was been on to move it up 2 years. Next slide. So the big changes that I see with nationwide permits that are proposed are here listed here. And I'll admit this is my subjective opinion of what are big changes. There's a proposal on certain nationwide permits to eliminate the 300-foot linear stream impact threshold that would require permitting under an individual permit rather than a nationwide permit. And then nationwide permit 12 is a permit for utility activities. And they are proposing some changes to nationwide permit 12. And they're also proposing 2 new nationwide permits. So that what's all under the large nationwide nationwide permit 12 umbrella now, all utility activities, they would split. So nationwide permit would be reserved for oil and gas activities. A new nationwide permit that they're calling C would be for electric utilities. And the nationwide permit D would be for water utility activities. And just while I'm on this note about the new nationwide permits, the other ones that they proposed are a nationwide permit for water reuse, such as stormwater facilities, and then 2 nationwide permits that are related to mariculture, seaweed, shellfish, and fish mariculture. So I'm in Minnesota, so I didn't think the mariculture ones were very, very significant. But in the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about those in more detail. So let's go to the next slide. So the 300 linear foot stream bed impact, that is a criterion for certain nationwide permits that would, if there's greater than 300 feet impact, that would elevate it to an individual permit. And that applies to, I don't know, 6 or 8 existing nationwide permits that pertain to energy development, mining, other types of development. And instead of a criterion that is based on the linear length of the stream, the proposal is to base it on square footage or acreage of impacts. So this is very similar to the way wetland impacts are calculated now in terms of acreage, but they would change the criteria on a stream impact from linear length of the stream to acreage of the stream. So the nationwide permits that, they require mitigation for greater than 1/10 of an acre threshold, and they have a 1/2 acre threshold for individual permits. So that stream impact would be considered the same way, quantified the same way wetlands are quantified. So this may require a little more documentation in the field. If you're a consultant and you're documenting, where there may be stream impacts, streams are not uniformly, they do not have a uniform width. They vary from place to place. And so then you've got to be able to collect enough data in the field that you can determine what would be an impact to that streams in terms of acreage rather than just linear feet of impact to the stream length. So that's how that's different. Let's go on to the next slide. Nationwide permit 12, the utility nationwide permit, they're proposing a lot of changes in the PCN requirements. And if you recall from a few slides ago, PCN is the pre-construction notification. So it's changes in whether or not an application is required. So a lot of utility work takes place in wetlands with no permanent loss of wetlands. They excavate, install a pipeline, backfill, restore the original contours, reseed. So there's really no wetland loss. So this nationwide permit allows a lot of activity to happen without notification, without notification or without an individual permit, because as long as there's no wetland loss or very little limited wetland loss. So a lot of these criteria that would require a PCN or an application are being eliminated for the new nationwide 12. And then the ones that are going to be retained for nationwide permit 12 would be if there's a 1/10 of an acre loss, if it's work in a navigable water, meaning, to a Section 10 Rivers and Harbor Act, traditional navigable water involved in interstate commerce, or a new oil and gas pipeline that's less than 250 miles. And I see I made a typo there. I should have, that should be a less than a greater than sign. So those are the changes with nationwide permit 12 reporting thresholds. Okay, next slide. So to summarize my talk, There's significant changes that are taking place that have taken place to how waters of the U.S. are defined. Easternal ephemeral streams are removed from waters of the U.S. and wetlands adjacent to ephemeral streams are no longer waters of the U.S. Now, I want to be clear, that is a rule that has taken effect. There are significant changes proposed to nationwide permits, and these are just proposed changes, removing the linear impact on stream impacts, fewer notification requirements for utilities and pipelines, several new nationwide permits proposed. The comment period for these proposed changes closed in November 16th. It remains to be seen whether or not this rule is finalized before the new administration takes effect. I know the outgoing administration has proposed lots of changes to regulations in the last couple of months, so it remains to be seen if they squeeze this through or not. I suspect that if a new rule is not published before the new administration takes place, the rule will probably not take effect as defined. I suspect they will redefine and come back sometime, in the future with a revised proposed rule. Next slide. In terms of the waters of the US, there have been at least 10 lawsuits filed. In my last count, there's over 20 states that are involved in those lawsuits. And so we may wind up with a patchwork across the country of where the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is in effect and where it's not in effect. It's currently on hold in Colorado. A federal court issued an injunction to withhold implementation of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So it is in effect in all states and territories in the United States, except Colorado. Again, the election is probably going to affect how this goes forward. If a proposed change comes forward for the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, that has to go through a formal rulemaking process. So that's going to be a multi-year process to formally change that rule if it happens. What could affect how that rule is interpreted in the short term is how the new administration, the executive branch, the Corps of Engineers, EPA, the Justice Department views regulation and implementation of the rule and view how they respond to litigation and enforcement actions. So they would immediately be able to change direction on how they want to react or approach a case that's in litigation. It's going to take longer for them to issue a new rule if they want to change the Navigable Water Protection Rule. So that creates a lot of uncertainty about waters of the US because, any day a federal court could issue a ruling saying we're going to modify the Navigable Waters Protection Rule and modify waters of the US in a given state. It may not apply nationwide, it may apply to just a given state or a group of states. So if you're a consultant or somebody concerned about water regulation, how do you deal with that? My recommendation is you document every water feature, every polygon that you define on the landscape, and then you document information about that. Think back to the definitions I gave you about waters of the US and the exemptions of the waters of the US. So those are the criteria that you need to think about to help determine if a water body is regulated or not. So things like connectivity, the duration of stream flow, or the origin of a water body or a basin. Those are things that are going to be important to make that determination. This is where tools like as Ecobot and a lot of tools from Esri provide an opportunity to document that in the field and then to maintain that in a database. So if there is a rule change, you can just go back and you can update your maps or report that shows what where things are isolated or not, or how they're connected or not connected. And that's a way you can deal with the uncertainty. So you've got the information, you can react very quickly if the rules change in relation to litigation. And again, and as always, I recommend early discussions with regulators, especially if you have complex situations for wetland determination or jurisdictional determination. So next slide. Okay, there's a shameless plug for myself. If you want to contact me, here's how you can reach me. We have time for questions in the chat at the end, or you can reach out to me personally if you have any questions or want to discuss this further. Thank you, Jeremy and Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate that. Thanks for taking us through that complex group of information there. It's now my pleasure to introduce Victoria Colangelo, who's going to discuss the impacts of changes to wetlands and mitigation banking.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm honored to be a part of this very impressive panel. Thank you so much to Ecobot for inviting me to show my perspective as a mitigation bank representative and a Florida perspective as well. So a little bit about me. I've been selling mitigation credits since 2004. I've specialized in selling credits. And then most recently, about 2 years ago, I started selling mitigation banks, the land with the credits. So I've been very successful in doing both, connecting the buyers and the sellers of mitigation banks. And then of course, with selling mitigation credits, connecting developers and consultants with the appropriate mitigation options. So I've had a fantastic career so far, and I'm very, very blessed to be in this industry. This industry fell in my lap when I was a senior at UCF, and I was called in for an interview. I wasn't even looking for a job. And so I worked my way up from intern to president, and 4 years ago, I started my own company, and it's been absolutely a blessing. So just to give you a little bit of input on how my perspective of these policies with regulations, we can go to the next slide. So, as you know, and as Daniel pointed out in his presentation, the new Navigable Water Protection Rule limits the extent of federal regulation, rescinding the 2015 Clean Water Rule that Obama placed. And as you may or may not know, this all stemmed from the 1988 Rapanos versus US ruling, where it was an 18-year court battle, and Justice Scalia and Justice Kennedy both had different opinions. And Justice Scalia wanted to regulate more wetlands of the United States. And Justice Kennedy had an approach of, Scalia had an approach of reducing the wetland impacts. And hence, there was this ambiguity for so long. And in 2015, Obama was able to put those increased restrictions on isolated wetlands and open waters in the United States. And so now with this new regulation that just happened in June 22nd, now it's more easier for developers and environmental consultants to be able to have clarity and know exactly what will require federal mitigation and which won't. So, you know, I perceived it as a good step moving forward, and it would increase, you know, the permitting timelines, because I've seen it, you know, expand from 2 to 7 years to get, you know, a permit. And so, however, what I've seen in talking with many environmental consultants throughout the state of Florida is that it's taking, you know, 2 to 6 months after they submit their JD request form, which, whoops, I don't think this link works on this spreadsheet. I thought it would, but if you go to that form on my website under resources, mitigationbankinginc.com, you can see the form that you can download and email to the Corps and wait on a response and then move forward with your planning. Fortunately for states like Florida, Michigan, and New Jersey, we have state oversight. So regardless, those isolated wetlands are being mitigated in the state of Florida. And so that's great. And it's estimated that EPA suggested that there's about 85% overlap. So the state and federal agencies, 85% are navigable waters. And so it doesn't make much of a difference. And so the 15% or so are isolated wetlands that are still being regulated by the state. I haven't seen much less federal mitigation needed yet. I have about 130 credits reserved right now that are pending closing, and out of all those projects, only 0.6 credits, one project doesn't need the federal as they anticipated because of this new rule. And I'm sure more will come, but right now I'm only working on one project out of about 50 or 60 different projects. So, and that's on the east coast of Florida. So anyways, so a lot of interesting perspectives on, the WOTUS rule and how this will, affect moving forward with permitting. And, was stated before, who knows? You know, this is probably should be challenged again. It's going to take a lot of effort, and you know, they're going to have a defensible argument, require evidence of, you know, how, you know, this would be modified if this were ever to be rescinded again and open up the process. But I'm assured that that wouldn't happen even if we started today for, you know, 3 to 4 years. So a lot of projects are moving fast so they can get grandfathered in, get those JD forms in, and so that way you are set. All right, next policy change I want to talk to you about is specific to Florida. You can go to the next slide. You may or may not live in Florida. You may not, you know, be affected, but Florida is one of the prestigious premier wetland mitigation areas in the country, and they are currently looking into, and we'll know next week if it's approved, to be able to shift the Clean Water Act Section 404 from the Army Corps of Engineers to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And what that would mean is all projects except Section 10 will be shifted over to FDEP to regulate. And so currently the Corps, you know, is just working on those big priority projects and going to shift everything to FDP if it's approved. And so that's going to be an interesting challenge for us, I think, you know, to be able to have those resources. And but DEP is confident. Like I said, they have an 85% overlap. So they're like, we're already working on these projects. Might as well streamline it. DEP will manage it at first. And then once they get the process together, I understand that they'll start flowing it to the 5 different water management districts in Florida who primarily oversee the wetland impacts for the state side. DEP just does individual family homes and linear projects. So I guess they feel like they can put some more on their plate and alleviate the core of those responsibilities. So I think that's really interesting because, you know, it may be the wave of the future for other states as well to take back their, you know, regulations so that when these federal nuances happen with isolated wetlands, the state still maintains a regulation over the isolated wetlands, and therefore they're not just being left out and not being compensated for. Mitigation banks will continue to be permitted by the Army Corps of Engineers. They will not go to FDEP. So that was good. And we're excited for the changes, good or bad. It's going to be interesting. I know Michigan did that, changed over from the Corps to the state's regulation. And I'm not sure if they were, if they've been successful with that program. I've put in a couple calls, but I haven't heard back yet. And I'd like to pick their brain on their perspective. And like I said, New Jersey has a state program, but I'm not sure if they've navigated over there as well. So it might be an emerging trend. Florida, you know, of course, is the forefront of the industry because we have a lot of wetlands. And I think that's it. I think, you know, just let me know if you have any questions at the end. And thank you again so much for being here and listening to me with my perspective.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Great to have you join us here today. All right. So for our last speaker, new connection for me. Jeff and I have been spending a lot of time together the last half year or so. Jeff is also with Esri. So Jeff, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks. Hey, everyone. My name is Jeff Pearson. I'm with Esri out in the Denver, Colorado area. Shout out to Florida. My career actually started down in South Florida, just outside of Fort Lauderdale. So I'm very familiar with the wetland landscape down there. I have a strong consulting background with wetlands and waters of the U.S., working for various A&E firms and the federal agencies as well. But most times people wonder what Esri's specific role is in the wetland community. And I think I did a pretty good job with kind of making more of a further connection because of my strong wetland background. And essentially what I'm doing specifically is I consult on kind of the actual data storage, all the data curation, if you're manipulating any of the data, all of the data sharing. I also consult on wetland procedure and protocol. Right now, I'm currently on the national team, so I'm consulting with Department of the Interior, Army Corps, Department of Energy, Forest Service, BOR. So basically, any of the major land management agencies, right? So we also like to partner with very innovative companies like Ecobot that are innovating the wetland field. We are trying to create a further initiative for the one federal decision that the White House came out with a few years ago. So that was a big priority for us. We like to come up with new ways to streamline processes, both when you're out in the field doing work and back at the office. So when you're collecting all that data, how should you be doing your data management and all of your analysis as well? I like to build new apps for wetland professionals to use for, of the different workflows and all the processes if you have any imagery. And we also like to help our customers, such as the regulators and the federal agencies, understand all that data and how that technology can assist them with whatever it is that they're trying to do. Next slide, please. So specifically, what we are doing with the wetland science and policy, right? You can see, we have a lot of executive orders that wind up sneaking in. Some of them aren't as publicized as others. One of the biggest things I wanted to kind of throw out there is that a lot of the authoritative data sets don't typically change based off of policy. It changes off of science, such as the National Wetlands Inventory or the NHD or any of the other water type of the actual GIS data. All that is based off of science, right? So the actual data schemas, all of the data migration and all that stuff, it's super important, right? But the best data that you could possibly play with is ones that you actually collect yourselves, right? I know that there are a lot of wetland pros in right now, so I'm sure you guys are using Trimble's and Garmin's and hopefully Ecobot, right? When you're actually out in the field and collecting that actual data. So let's go over to the next slide. So when you're navigating the wetland policy with specific data sources, it's important to use, you want to use the actual open source data because you don't want to spend a whole lot of money, right? It can get really expensive. And there are a lot of great authoritative of the sources that come from the USGS or the NRCS of all that soils data. The USGS has the NHD, which is amazing. And I'll definitely get more into that later in the presentation. But it's also important to understand what your data is actually doing when you're doing the analysis techniques and how these new policies impact that data, right? As they were saying earlier, something like the adjacent wetlands, or what do they consider, jurisdictional, like the bed, banks and the benches to streams and the rivers and stuff. So it's also important to pull all of your actual data sources into one centralized and editable location. So I know a lot of scientists are still using shape files and they're still using, like the Excel spreadsheets, but, I wanted to kind of do a shameless plug for file geodatabases and enterprise geodatabases. It's just way easier to manage a lot of that data. So let's go to the next slide. So I did make a story map, which I will plug at the end, on essentially a very basic workflow. It doesn't show a lot of what's going on in the actual background, but this story map does kind of take you through step by step what the data and what the output actually looks like when you're using some of these different models and algorithms. Next slide. So I specifically used a project that is kind of near my house in Colorado called the C470 project. They're already under construction. I think they're almost done. It's probably about, I don't know, 10 to 15 mile corridor, and I pulled in the National Wetlands Inventory as kind of a basis. I think when we do a lot of pre-scoping on projects, we use the NWI, and then we wind up going out into the field to confirm what's actually there and what's not. Next slide. So this is an executive order that came out of the White House in October. I don't think it had that much traction, but if you actually go through the story map, it kind of takes you through what this EO actually is. Next slide. So this is some field data of the project. You have your ordinary high water mark, you have your benches, and you have your banks, and you have your actual the waterway. And so we wanted to see, well, what the impacts were under the actual new water rule. Next slide. And kind of the same thing with what was actually being impacted from the right-of-way, based on the policy from the new water rule in 2015. And then so when we go to the next slide, we can see how that's changed. It's about I think it's about 0.15 acres of difference there. Next slide. And then when you look at the whole project, that actually winds up being, multiple acres, which would accounts for millions of dollars of work in the mitigation costs. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of dive into what the actual data is doing. So when you pull in soils data from the NRCS, and I get a lot of my actual math and the actual algorithms from the Society of Wetland Scientists journals that I get quarterly. So it'll typically say what soils there are, pertinent for like the riparian areas, and how acidic the actual soils are for the hydric soils in the wetlands. So again, I wanted to say that it's way more important to pull data that you're actually getting from the field. And there's techniques that you can use within ArcGIS Pro to interpolate those points to get a more accurate representation of what the actual soil types are. So next slide. So when you pull in actual elevation data, and this is from the USGS, right? So you essentially want to layer all of this stuff on top of each other, because the actual model or the algorithm, you want the output to be as accurate as possible. And without the actual elevation data, it would be very difficult to do that. So when you actually put in all of the special parameters for your area and all of your soil types, you can actually get a reclassification and an output of where the actual areas are that are going to be most likely to be wetlands or waters of the US or riparian areas. Next slide. So this is the layered model here. So you have your soil data on top of the actual elevation data. And when you actually run that Python script or model, it could be either or. Next slide. You wind up getting outputs of where you can expect to find whatever you need to. If you're looking for high quality wetlands, or if you're looking for, you know, specific bench or like the banking types or soil types, you can actually pull these outputs from those specific parameters. And I'm in the process of building a web application right now to where you won't have to use an ArcGIS desktop environments to do this analysis. You should be able to just pop in all of your parameters, put in what you need, and then it should spit out an output that's like this. And so the actual data and the actual data schemas are really important when you're doing this, because if that data isn't pre-massaged, then it'll throw errors and it'll be very difficult. So I wanted to give another shameless plug to Ecobot, because their specific data schemas doesn't really need to be massaged, because all those parameters are already preset when you're looking at that data. As opposed to if you're out there in the field with like a Trimble or a Garmin or something like that. So shameless plug, shout out to those guys. And I think that's the end of my presentation. If I don't think I have another slide. There you go. Yeah. I'll go ahead and post my story map in the chat. I'll also put it out on my Twitter and on my LinkedIn. So if you don't follow me, please do. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Also appreciate the time in putting that together. That was a really interesting workflow, how you're able to quantify the actual areas based on the regulations. And I think that could also be used to see where maybe surveys needed to be redone if something changes mid-project. So I think that there's a common thread that has come up through these presentations, and that is the digitization of data. And it's really important. When scientists and consultants translate biological data into digital data, it can then be used in planning, resiliency, regulatory environments, and all providing additional value beyond that single project. Additionally, and important to point out, in the 21st century, things are data-driven. And if data isn't available, then there's no voice and no representation and no seat at the table for making decisions. Next slide. So the picture emerging that we see in wetland science is one of interconnectedness and shared efficiencies. So this is the new digital ecosystem where a network of hardware, software, and science works together in the planning and conservation of natural resources.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And just want to keep this very brief. For those of you who have not met Ecobot yet, iOS, wetland delineation forms, automate your PDFs. This is what our customers are doing. They're winning more bids, they're a lot more competitive, and they're a lot more profitable. And pretty excited about this right now. This is our first time building kind of the beginnings of a story map with Esri as well. But with over 15,000 sample points across the United States, we're pretty excited to see how this is coming together. So thank you for all of those of you who have been helping to contribute to better science. Quick plug for our next webinar, which will be held the day after the inauguration. We will be having a guest panel and presenters of all women in wetland science and technology. So really looking forward to that. Hope you can join us on January 21st. Look for more information either via email or on LinkedIn and other social media places.
Awesome. That sounds really exciting, Jeremy. And I really enjoy these, so looking forward to that one as well. I'd like to just take a moment again to thank all of our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. Now we have a little bit of remaining time, and I'd like to transition into the Q&A. Quick reminder, although I see that most folks have been using this, you can submit questions by clicking the Q&A button down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So to kick us off, and this was mentioned briefly in one of the presentations, and this is towards Corinna. There's a unique position in Colorado, and I was wondering if you could help us to understand in a little bit more detail the moratorium placed on the new Navigable Waters Rule in Colorado, what that means for the industry, for wetlands, and for consultants and regulators.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So as they mentioned, in Colorado, we have an injunction against the current 2020 rule. And what's interesting to me is that we also had an injunction against the 2015 rule. So the 2015 rule was thought to be too overarching, that it was trying to regulate too many areas, whereas the 2019 rule is thought to be deregulating too many areas and leaving too many areas in Colorado unregulated. So as you know, the previous speakers have mentioned, the ephemeral channels and the isolated wetlands, which in Colorado is a huge component of what we have in Colorado as our wetlands that help feed other systems. So Colorado does not have any kind of state regulating agency right now that protects those isolated channels or isolated wetlands or the ephemeral streams. So that was a big contention on how they were able to keep that injunction for 2019 going into play. And I've spoken with some of the regulators here in Colorado with the Corps, and there's not a current plan on how long the 2019 injunction will be in place. The 2015 injunction was in place all the way up until the 2019 rule came into play. And then very quickly, we had the injunction on the 2019 regulation. So Colorado has been working basically off of the 1980 regulations, the Rapanos, and the other amendments that have been out for decades. So for us, it's kind of we're just plugging along as we have been previously. I would say the one thing that we're seeing a change is that because we have several districts within Colorado, they all have different standards when it comes to mapping wetlands and delineating for our reports. So the Sacramento district will have new criteria because they're looking at the 2019 rule. So some of those will come into play in Colorado. So I think we'll be mapping things differently and reporting them to the Corps differently, but it won't affect our regulation.
Great, thank you. So we are getting to the top of the hour here. So for those of you who only had allocated an hour to be with us, you know, we understand if you need to go. There are a lot of great questions that have been coming in. So we are going to, if you don't mind sticking on for another 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to continue our discussion here. So thanks for those of you who do need to go. The next question is partly a hybrid of a couple of questions that came in directed from the audience. And, you know, we are, you know, of course, seeing some particular changes in the regulation of waters of the United States. But what the question here is how are we seeing changes in the mitigation industry? One aspect or one question that came in respect to this was how are previously banked credits in respect to streams, thinking about ephemeral stream credits, how are those going to be handled by the Army Corps of Engineers? And what other changes are we seeing within this? And so I think since we're talking about streams, maybe we should start up north and go over to Daniel DeJoode, if you wouldn't mind coming in.
What was the question, Jeremy?
Just in response, how are we seeing, what changes are we seeing in the mitigation banking industry in respect to wetlands and streams?
I haven't had enough contact with mitigation banking since the new rule came into place,
Okay,
so
all
I
right.
don't have an answer for that.
Okay, I was thinking that you had a little bit more influence there. So, well, let's jump down to Florida then. Thanks, Daniel. And we'll, Victoria, you said you hadn't seen too much change yet, but if you could open that one up a little bit.
Yeah, I think for future, projects, it's going to reduce the federal regulation needed for sure. I'm anticipating that to be about 15% or so. And like I said, the state will continue to take care of those isolated impacts, but have not seen a lot of projects that are currently reserved that have been in, the hopper for 3 to 6 months as far as a reservation, coming back and saying they don't need the federal credits anymore. Like I said, we're still early in the game. That could change, but only about 1 project's come back, and the bank has no federal credits back, so they're actually going to buy them back and use them for another project. So, which is good.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think the place that I'm seeing big changes, and I know some of the folks here on the panel have also seen, is a slowdown in general concurrence, whether it's PJDs or JDs or any sort of permitting application. And so would love to kind of put that on the table and talk about that a little bit. And I love to jump back out to Corinna and see what you're seeing out in Colorado and in the other states that you're working in.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, just what your experience has been with the recent changes in implementation of the Navigable Water Rule and how that has impacted the permitting and concurrence process.
So I personally haven't seen an impact as of yet. I think I will start to see one as we get more into the next field year. This came along kind of late in the season, just for me personally. Where I see the biggest difference is that I think we're going to see a shift in clients going from predominantly pre-JDs to more AJDs, unless we hear these stories of the Corps taking forever to go through the AJD process. So we might still see clients going through that pre-JD process just to expedite the permitting. But I feel like if there are so many areas that are no longer going to be federally regulated, a client's not going to want to go ahead and put the cost of mitigating those areas if that's not a federal regulation anymore. So that's where I see some of the changes occurring. I see more intensive mapping being required when we're out in the field. So I think that's where Ecobot, just a plug for Ecobot again, is going to come into play, just because the Corps is starting to request that they want nondescript names on any of the mapping, but they want everything mapped. So before, and maybe that just means we're more creative in how we create our project area boundary, so that we're eliminating some of those waters, because it does take a lot of time to map everything when you know that that's not going to be regulated and it's not impacted by your project. So I think those are some of the changes that we're going to see.
Yeah, I know that some other consultants that I have spoken with in recent months have spoken to needing to increase their scopes. I know the intention of the original executive order was to potentially reduce the costs of environmental permitting. And I think we're seeing the opposite of that. And partly, I think what we're seeing is that the Corps wants to make sure they're taking care of covering themselves and making sure that everything is recorded. And especially if we see any changes in the next year or two with the change of administration, we're going to need to be able to track everything. So Daniel, what are you experiencing up in Minnesota?
Since the new rule took effect, I've had a few projects go through AJD process, and one of them started before the new rule took effect, and it was a very long process, 6 months or more. And then I've had a couple others that were actually very quick because the Corps recognized, they immediately recognized they qualified for one of the exemptions, and within weeks issued an AJD. So in that regard, that seemed faster than the old process or under the new old rule. But I think Corinna makes a good point about the timeline. So if you are planning project schedules, you probably should be thinking about a longer schedule for more AJD requests, because there's going to be more areas that are not regulated. So it's to the benefit of a project developer to get that AJD, because they're not paying for extra permitting or extra mitigation costs.
Yeah, we've heard from some consultants working down in the Gulf and along in the Atlantic seaboard that some of the AJD process now is ramping up to sometimes a year or more, which is pretty intensive to think about.
Yeah, that's a big hit on the project schedule.
Yes, it is. And we've also been hearing about some consultants being requested by clients to go back in the field and re-record data and within the context of new waters, and seeing if they can get something submitted while we're in this period that we're in right now. Have you been requested to get back out in the field at all with that?
No, I haven't had that experience.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like it's few and far between, but it's definitely something I've been hearing about a little bit, and it's important to kind of think about and call out.
That's kind of why I thought it was more important to dig into the details on the rule, what the new rule is, what is the definition of water use, and what are the exemptions, and then understand some of those thresholds with nationwide permits, so you can plan to collect all the data up front and then document it appropriately, so that if there are changes, there are questions, you've got that information available. So hopefully you can minimize the risk of having to go back out.
Great. Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Corinna, for weighing in on that.
Corinna, you had mentioned something a moment ago about software and kind of how that can be used with project areas and what data is being gathered. I'd like to dive into that a little bit deeper, and then open that up to all of the panelists and kind of learn thoughts on how software like Esri, ArcGIS, WebGIS, Ecobot, and others can help consultants and mitigation bankers meet these changing policy criteria and regulatory demands. So can we start with you, Corinna?
Sure. So one thing that what I'm encouraging our staff to implement is we have a really robust data dictionary that we've created for ArcGIS. So when we're in the field and collecting that data, we're just adding additional columns to define maybe what a reach is considered, but in the field we'll call it ephemeral, so that we have the data. It's in a massive data set, but we can filter that out. We can clean it up for what the Corps requires when we need to submit those aquatic resource data sheets. But if there's a client need, because a client wants to see how many ephemeral channels or how many perennial channels, or they want to know the actual name of the channel, that it's called the Cache Laputa River, whereas the Corps doesn't want to see those names anymore, we still have that data. It's all in one spot. It's just how we're filtering the data, so that as Daniel was mentioning, we don't have to go back out into the field and recollect the data. It's just how we're analyzing it. So that's been a big thing for us. And then having, software like Ecobot that makes it faster to collect the data when we're actually in the field. I think that makes it a lot easier to adapt to some of these changes, because if you have to go out and spend more time in the field, anything that helps expedite that is going to be beneficial. And when you're talking about adding costs for regulations, those are ways to help, kind of offset some of those in some ways.
Interesting. I think that definitely holds true with the pattern that we're seeing of this digitizing data. So, it's better to get more data, and then you never really know how valuable that's going to be, because something might change, and you don't have to go out there again to get more. Victoria, do you have any thoughts on this as far as how software can help meet these changes?
Not really, although I will say, just polling environmental consultants that are using Ecobot, they're saying that it's very helpful for large projects, especially if there's a lot of, wetlands that they can kind of stamp over it and be a lot more quicker and efficient. And so even if you have, one big project, Ecobot would be, beneficial for your project to be able to reduce that time and be more efficient.
That's great to hear. And how about you, Daniel? Any additional insights you can offer from your perspective?
Well, I'll just reiterate what I said and what Corinna said about collecting data. You're collecting lots of data, and there's so much flexibility with using a data dictionary and Esri tools to document that data. And then on the back end, there's a lot of flexibility, a lot of ways to visualize and present the data, to export into a table, to put in a report, or to create figures where you symbologize things differently. So you can show your wetlands that are totally isolated, your wetlands that are connected with an ephemeral stream, wetlands that are connected or adjacent to an intermittent stream. There's documenting all that. Then you've got the software that you can show it. So if there are changes in whatever in regulations in whatever way, you're able to adapt, and you can immediately be able to determine which water bodies, which wetlands are regulated or not regulated.
So on that note, and this I think also will go to all the panelists, what do you, looking forward, do you think are some of the challenges that technology is going to face when it comes to compliance? Do you want to continue on that thread of thought, Daniel?
Sure. I think one of the challenges, we've kind of touched on it in the Q&A chat box, is that it deals with the connectivity of some water bodies. If you recall, when I presented the list of water bodies, it said the third one said certain lakes, certain lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters. There's a lot of confusion with that, because according to the Corps regulation, the Navigable Water Protection Rule, there are, this term certain is confusing. Well, what is certain? Well, then it says that, some water bodies, some lakes could be jurisdictional if they're just connected through an ephemeral stream that only flows in a typical year, that it flows in a typical year. Well, that's really confusing to me. Like, well, what if there's an adjacent wetland to that lake? Is that what, if the only connection is an ephemeral stream, but the ephemeral stream's not jurisdictional, but a lake can be jurisdictional through an ephemeral stream, does that, what happens with that adjacent wetland? I think that's an area where there's going to be some confusion, and it's going to require, case by case discussion with the Corps. And maybe the Corps of Engineers has already figured out how to deal with that. I know when the Navigable Waters first rule was implemented this summer, and I was going through an AJD on a project with the Corps, and they're like, we don't even know where this is going to go. That's 6 months ago, so I'm sure they're come a long way since then. But that's this whole thing with adjacency or connection of certain lakes and impoundments is a area of great confusion to me still.
Yeah, most certainly. Corinna, do you have any thoughts on the same question? So what are some of the challenges for technology as we kind of move into the future, right? So technology is changing, and the regulations and policy is changing. So we have these two trajectories going forward. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult on the technology side to implement some of these changes. When I think specifically from, say, Ecobot's perspective, they have the wetland determination form, so all the data gets uploaded into that wetland determination form. But if those sides that are the regulatory side are changing frequently, then the applications also have to change to meet those adaptations. And in the field, the science isn't necessarily changing. It's just what's being required from the regulatory perspective that's changing. And so I think that makes just a balancing perspective, that you still need to support the science, but the end product is that regulatory compliance and what the Corps needs, and the ability to quickly adapt to those changes. That's where I see the biggest hindrance or complication in the future.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Victoria, do you have any additional thoughts on this question that you might want to offer?
No, I think she covered it.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for those of you who stuck on with us after hours here. It's been a little over 15 minutes now, so I think we're going to go ahead and close it up. I know there were a few more questions that came in that we did not get to today, but thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to to Daniel and the folks at Esri for helping put this together as well. And Corinna, Daniel, and Victoria, you guys did wonderful today. Looking forward to the next webinar coming up on January 21st. Put that on your calendars. You should see stuff out about that soon. And want to wish you all happy holidays, and we'll see you in 2021. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.